Welcome to Business for People in a Hurry. Let's dive into Hot Seat, the memoir of Jeff Immelt, the man who stepped into the shoes of a corporate legend, inherited an empire under immense pressure, and fought through crisis after crisis during his time as CEO of General Electric. This isn't your average corporate story. It's a high-stakes business thriller about leadership, resilience, and navigating one of the most turbulent periods in modern history. Picture this. It's September 2001. Jeff Immelt has just taken the reins at GE, succeeding Jack Welch, the undisputed titan of business. Welch wasn't just a CEO, he was a myth, a man who quadrupled GE's revenue and transformed it into a global powerhouse. Following him was like being handed the keys to a Ferrari while driving into a tornado. And then, just 2 days into Immelt's tenure, the unthinkable happens. September 11th. The terrorist attacks not only shook the world, but hit GE right where it hurt. Aviation, one of its biggest divisions, grounded. Insurance, overwhelmed with claims. The financial fallout was devastating. And that was just the beginning. Immelt soon discovered a ticking time bomb. Nearly half of GE's earnings came from GE Capital, its financial services arm. The foundation Welch had built was shakier than anyone realized. So, what does Immelt do? He makes a bold move. He decides to slim down GE, pivoting back to its industrial roots. But slimming down a conglomerate like GE isn't a simple task. It's like turning a massive ship in the middle of a hurricane. And the timing couldn't have been worse. Just as Immelt was offloading risky financial assets, the 2008 financial crisis hit. Lehman Brothers collapsed, markets tanked, and GE, loaded with debt, found itself staring down the barrel of disaster. Its stock price was cut in half. Immelt had to scramble, making emergency moves just to keep the company alive. It was pure survival mode. But let's take a step back. Who is Jeff Immelt? What kind of leader takes on a challenge like this? Immelt wasn't just another corporate executive. He believed in GE's mission to tackle the world's toughest problems. He had vision, energy, and a deep-seated belief that GE could be a force for good. But he also had a harsh reality to face. No matter what he did, no matter how hard he worked, he would always be compared to Welch. And Welch's legacy? It was a shadow so massive it could eclipse anyone. One of Immelt's biggest bets was on global expansion. He saw emerging markets like China, India, and the Middle East as the key to GE's future. These weren't just growth opportunities, they were survival strategies. If GE could lead in healthcare, aviation, and renewable energy in these regions, it could carve out a future-proof business. But the execution? It was anything but smooth. Cultural differences, regulatory hurdles, and fierce local competition made the path far rockier than Immelt had anticipated. And then there were the critics. Employees whispered that Immelt was dismantling everything Welch had built. Investors complained that his long-term strategies weren't delivering quick returns. The media? They labeled him the man who destroyed GE. Can you imagine carrying that weight for 16 years? Yet Immelt didn't write this memoir to play defense. He wrote it to learn, to dissect what worked, what didn't, and why. He asked the hard questions. Did I make the right decisions at the right time? Could I have handled the crises differently? And perhaps most importantly, what can today's leaders take away from my journey? Here's the thing. Hot Seat isn't just a book about business. It's a story about resilience. It's about what happens when you're thrown into the fire, when the odds are stacked against you, and when every choice you make feels like it could make or break everything. Immelt doesn't sugarcoat his failures. That's what makes his story so compelling. He owns his mistakes, reflects on them, and shares the hard-earned lessons that only come from being in the trenches. As we unpack Immelt's 16 years at GE, we'll explore the challenges he faced, the bold bets he made, and the legacy he left behind. Whether you're leading a team, building a business, or just navigating life's curveballs, there's something in the story for you. Let's get into it. First up, the chaotic early days of Immelt's tenure, taking over from Jack Welch, weathering the shock of 9/11, and steering a company on the brink. Stay with me. This ride is just getting started. Jeff Immelt starts Hot Seat with a story that's as ironic as it is revealing. Picture this, the summer of 2001, just as he's about to take over as CEO of General Electric. He's playing golf, and a fellow player casually remarks, "Whoever takes over after Jack Welch is in for a tough time." Little did this golfer know, the man he was talking to is Jeff Immelt himself. Talk about foreshadowing. Now, let's set the stage. General Electric, GE, isn't just any company. Founded by Thomas Edison in 1892, GE grew into an industrial titan. By 1981, when Jack Welch became CEO, its market capitalization stood at $12 billion. 20 years later, under Welch's leadership, that number exploded to $400 billion. Welch wasn't just a CEO. He was a business icon, dubbed the manager of the century. He revolutionized management, turned GE into a global powerhouse, and left a legacy so monumental that stepping into his shoes felt like being asked to rewrite history. That was Immelt's reality. He wasn't just inheriting a company, he was inheriting the expectations of an entire era. Welch had built an empire, but as Immelt quickly learned, it was an empire with cracks just beneath the surface. Before officially taking over, Immelt did his due diligence. He met with over 600 executives and uncovered a startling truth. Finance staff at GE outnumbered engineers 5-1. GE, the company synonymous with industrial innovation, had become a financial juggernaut. 40% of its revenue came from GE Capital, its financial arm. And while that division had driven short-term profits, it was also stifling long-term innovation. Engineers with groundbreaking ideas were being told to shelve their projects because they didn't fit into quarterly earnings goals. Immelt knew this was unsustainable. And then, just 2 days after Immelt officially became CEO, the world changed forever. September 11, 2001. The terrorist attacks not only shook the world, but hit GE where it hurt most. Aviation, one of its cornerstone divisions, came to a standstill as flights were grounded. Insurance claims poured in, overwhelming GE's financial services. Within a week, the company's stock had plummeted 20%, erasing $70 billion in market value. Immelt hadn't even warmed his seat, and he was already facing one of the toughest crises in GE's history. But how did GE get to this point? To understand, we need to rewind to the 1980s, when Jack Welch was in his prime. GE Capital had started as a small operation, offering loans to help customers finance GE products. Under Welch, it became a behemoth. GE wasn't just financing appliances anymore, it was underwriting insurance, issuing credit cards, and even investing in commercial real estate. Welch's strategy worked brilliantly in the short term. GE Capital generated enormous profits, funding acquisitions and stock buybacks that drove the company's growth. But by the time Immelt took over, it had become a ticking time bomb. Consider this, one of GE's financial innovations was its aircraft leasing business. GE didn't make planes, it made engines. To sell more engines, GE Capital started leasing planes to airlines that couldn't afford to buy them outright. On paper, it was genius. In practice, it was risky. When 9/11 grounded global aviation, those airlines couldn't pay their leases, and GE Capital suddenly found itself on the hook for billions. Immelt acted swiftly, securing government guarantees for struggling airlines and issuing billions in loans to stabilize the industry. But this was unfamiliar territory for him. As Immelt later reflected, being a leader doesn't mean you don't feel fear, it means you don't show it. You internalize the uncertainty, make tough calls, and project confidence, even when you're improvising solutions on the fly. But Immelt's challenges didn't stop there. He knew GE Capital had grown too big and was diverting resources from GE's industrial core. He began scaling it back, selling off assets like Genworth Financial and spinning others to firms like BlackRock. But when he tried to offload GE's long-term care insurance business, he faced resistance from an unexpected source, Jack Welch. Welch, the man who had chosen Immelt as his successor, wasn't shy about criticizing him. Immelt likened their relationship to that of a son-in-law with his mother-in-law. Both loved GE, but they had very different ideas about how to run it. Welch frequently appeared on GE-owned NBC to critique Immelt's leadership. At one point, Welch even made a harsh joke about wanting to grab a gun and shoot Immelt. Immelt wasn't just battling external crises, he was fighting to lead in the shadow of a man who had defined the company. When Jeff Immelt took the reins at GE, he didn't just inherit a company, he inherited a battlefield. The stakes were colossal, the challenges relentless, and the shadow of his predecessor, Jack Welch, ever present. So here's the burning question. How do you lead an industrial giant like GE when the odds are stacked against you? By its history, its structure, and even the world itself? Immelt's vision was clear. He wanted to reignite GE's industrial powerhouse, a force buried beneath the financial veneer Welch had so expertly crafted. When Immelt visited places like Egypt and China, he saw untapped potential. Power grids waiting to be built. Aviation markets primed to soar. These weren't just opportunities, they were billion-dollar openings. But GE's globalization strategy at the time? It was laughably disconnected. Executives in New York were making calls about markets they'd never even set foot in. Immelt wasn't about to let that stand. First, he lit the fire of localization. He didn't just shuffle executives, he overhauled entire systems. In Nigeria, a country brimming with untapped potential, Immelt replaced 95% of GE's leadership with local talent. These were people who knew the market and had the trust of their communities. The payoff? $1 billion in new orders in just 1 year. In China, he went even further, promoting local leaders and embedding Chinese executives into GE's core decision-making teams. This wasn't window dressing. It was a sustainable, long-term strategy for building trust and presence in critical markets. But localization was just the beginning. The second fire was cutting through GE's bloated bureaucracy. Between the CEO and the people doing the real work, there were 13 layers of management. 13. Immelt took one look at this and thought, how can we be nimble with this much dead weight? He slashed those layers and empowered frontline teams to make decisions. It wasn't just about saving costs, it was about stripping away the red tape and driving real results. The third fire? Redefining GE's role in its industries. Immelt didn't want GE to just sell engines or turbines. He wanted it to be a partner. Take China's aviation sector. Instead of just supplying engines, GE worked with local companies to develop commercial aircraft, train engineers, and navigate global sales. Immelt called it in China for China. It was a long game, sure, but the potential rewards were massive. By 2017, Immelt's globalization efforts had completely reshaped GE. When he started, 2/3 of GE's business was US-centric. By the time he stepped down, more than 70% of revenue came from international markets. Traditional manufacturing, once dismissed as a relic of the past, was generating $70 billion annually from overseas operations. And yet, despite these successes, the shadow of the 2008 financial crisis hung over his legacy. Immelt had been trying to downsize GE's financial arm since 2001, but resistance from internal stakeholders and the sheer inertia of GE's size slowed progress. When the subprime mortgage crisis hit, GE finance was still enormous, with liabilities in the hundreds of billions. What had once been Welch's cash cow was now a ticking time bomb. When financial markets froze in 2008, GE's reliance on short-term debt nearly brought the company to its knees. Immelt made tough, fast calls. He reached out to Warren Buffett for a lifeline, secured billions in equity, and even lobbied the U.S. government for guarantees. These moves saved GE, but not without cost. Regulators swooped in, and over the next few years, Immelt had to sell off assets at steep losses, bleeding billions in value. Looking back, Immelt made a sharp observation. In business, timing often trumps the brilliance of an idea. His decision to dismantle GE Finance in 2001 was sound, but the delay in execution left the company vulnerable when the crisis struck. Still, he argues, in moments of disaster, action, however imperfect, is better than hesitation. Waiting, he says, is time you'll never get back. When Immelt stepped down in 2017, GE was at a crossroads. After years of tension with the board, they let him retire quietly. But let's be clear, he didn't leave without trying to reshape the company's future. Take his push for digital transformation, for example. Immelt envisioned GE evolving into a tech-driven powerhouse, leveraging data and analytics to revolutionize industries. It was ambitious, but the board didn't share his conviction, and after his departure, GE's digital division was sold off, a missed opportunity to redefine the company's trajectory. Then there was the Alstom acquisition. On paper, it seemed strategic, expanding GE's energy footprint to keep pace with global demand. But internally, it became a mess. Steve Boltz, one of Immelt's key executives, wanted a guarantee that he'd be the next CEO in exchange for his support of the deal. Immelt refused, tensions flared, and Boltz left the company. The acquisition went through, but the division struggled to adapt as renewable energy surged, and GE's board had seen enough. Immelt's successor, John Flannery, took over, but his tenure lasted just a year before the challenges proved insurmountable. By 2021, GE announced it would split into 3 companies: aviation, healthcare, and energy. The company's stock price had dropped 70% since Jack Welch retired. It was a sobering moment. But as GE continued to unravel, many started to reassess Immelt's leadership. His challenges had been monumental, taking the helm in Welch's immense shadow, steering through crises like 9/11 and the 2008 financial meltdown, and navigating an increasingly volatile global economy. People began to ask, was the deck stacked against him from the start? Despite all this, Immelt doesn't view his tenure as a failure. In his memoir, he highlights 3 things he's proud of. First, stepping up during crises. Whether it was the aftermath of 9/11 or the chaos of the financial crisis, Immelt made tough, decisive calls when the stakes couldn't have been higher. Second, using systematic thinking to move GE into new markets like healthcare and renewable energy, industries with real growth potential. And third, cutting through GE's bloated management structure, making the company more agile and better positioned to adapt. But Immelt doesn't shy away from his mistakes. He admits that waiting too long to divest GE Finance was a major error. The timing wasn't right, and when the financial crisis hit, the fallout was devastating. He also acknowledges that his critical approach toward long-serving employees backfired, creating resentment instead of the change he hoped for. For aspiring leaders, Immelt distills his journey into 3 key lessons: responsibility, change, and trust. Responsibility means owning every decision, especially when things go wrong. Leadership isn't about avoiding blame. It's about stepping up, taking the heat, and navigating through the storm. Change is about never settling for the status quo. Leaders have to challenge norms, take risks, and embrace innovation. And trust? Trust is the foundation of leadership. Without it, even the best strategies can crumble. It's earned through respect, integrity, and consistency. All right, let's wrap this up. Jeff Immelt's Hot Seat isn't just a business memoir. It's a candid and unfiltered account of what it takes to lead through chaos. His journey reminds us that leadership isn't about perfection. It's about resilience, accountability, and the courage to keep moving forward, even when the odds are stacked against you. So, let me ask you, what's your legacy? How are you building something that lasts? Share your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear your take. If this story inspired you, give this video a like and subscribe for more deep dives into the lessons behind leadership and growth. Let's keep learning, keep building, and keep fighting for the things that matter.